The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Digital Footprints, the Perks and Pearls of Social Media on Today's Youth. My name is Chad Sievers. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, and really excited to have our speaker, Dr. Alyssa Daugherty, today. And she's going to talks about social media and all of that. So I'm going to let her introduce herself here in just a bit. But before we do so, I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping announcements. Okay, so we really encourage you all to ask questions during the webinar. And there's a question feature. It's found there on your screen. You can type those in and we'll get those answered. If you are interested in earning a CEU, just stick around to the very end. I'll have a code that's displayed there and give you some more instructions on how to earn a CEU at the conclusion of today's webinar. We are recording this webinar and it's going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel at a later date. And if this is a topic that you're interested in or like us on Facebook, follow us. We frequently that's where we post our upcoming training opportunities. We also have a newsletter. You can learn about us and what we're up to that way as well. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenter today and take it from there.
Thank you so much, Chad, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. Like Chad mentioned, my name is Dr. Alyssa Daugherty. I am an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences and a licensed psychologist. So a lot of my work is at the Child Study Center, which is located on the Arkansas Children's Hospital campus. And I work a lot with families from birth all the way up to adolescence, and primarily focus on treating traumatic stress. And I am really excited to be here today to talk to you guys about social media use and technology use in general. I think this has been a hot topic for a while and one that I was personally interested in looking a little bit more into. So today, I'm going to briefly review some of the historical data and trends that in the evolution of technology, particularly the use of social media and forms of communication that youth use and over the past 20 years or so. And I will say that when I first started developing the content for this presentation, I did not realize how many rabbit holes I would find myself in when I was researching. The irony is that with technological advancement and access to information, it just seems to be infinite and that you can never stop learning. And so this was sort of a meta issue that I experienced when I was developing the content for this presentation. And the amount of information I came across made it really hard to narrow down what I talked about today. So I will do my best to make sure that we cover everything kind of in an appropriate amount of breadth and depth. So I'm going to talk a little bit later on about some of the benefits and risks associated with social media use, and then touch on a little bit of parenting in terms of concerns that parents bring up, but also the ways in which parents actually use social media. And then a bulk of the presentation today is going to really focus on what can we do as mental health professionals to help support families as these concerns come up, and then kind of direct you to different resources that you can really verse yourself in, but also maybe disseminate to families as well. Okay, so first I want to launch a poll. So Chad, if you could bring up that first poll. So if you will just select the option that best describes your position. And I realize lots of positions may not be listed here So if you'll just select the one that just best describes who you are.
Oh, maybe another 5 seconds or so. We got most folks who have responded.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and close it.
Okay. So really majority of us here today are mental health professionals, and then another good percentage of social workers. Okay. That's good to know. If we want to launch then the second poll.
Sure. Is that what the social media platforms one?
Yes, I'm not sure. I'm not able to advance to the next slide for some reason.
Ah, okay. Let me get that going.
Okay, yeah. So if everyone could select the social media platforms that you use most often. This is obviously not a exhaustive list of social media platforms. We can only have up to 5, so I had to be a little choosy here.
Maybe another 5 seconds or so for folks to get their responses in. All right, I'm going to close it.
Okay. So really a majority of you are using Facebook and or Instagram kind of most often. And then just a little bit of you are using YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, and then some other platforms. These results are really consistent with what we find in terms of the percentage of social media platform use among youth as well. So I'll kind of get into that a little bit later. Okay, and then one last poll for today. How often do concerns related to technology or social media use arise in your job or practice?
Okay, maybe another 5 seconds or so. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
Okay, this is kind of what I expected. So about a third of you say kind of on a weekly basis, you're hearing about some concerns or challenges related to social media. And then some of you, it's at least once daily. And then for about 10% of you, multiple times daily. So, depending on kind of what your job is, the number of families that you work with, and who are on your caseload, the prevalence of this issue can vary a lot. But what this really tells us is that this issue is coming up pretty regularly. And so I'm really hoping that today's information can maybe help fill in some gaps or provide some insight and resources that you can use within your job and then with families that you work with. So this is a chart that shows kind of characteristics in several areas related to technology use across generations. So you can see that the change in attitudes from the maturest generation, who were largely disengaged from technology, to Generation Z, being considered technoholics or dependent on technology. So Gen Z has really been raised on the internet and social media, and some are actually already in the workforce. The next generation is Generation Alpha, and who will be referred to as alphas. So these are children who were born around 2012 and later. And these children haven't just grown up with technology, they've been completely immersed in it since birth. So early in their formative years, these children are comfortable speaking to like voice assistants and swiping on smartphones. So they don't just consider technology to be tools like some of us might, but rather really deeply integrated into everyday life. So I will say just in general, kind of the delineation of generations is a little bit arbitrary, but the oldest of today's kind of Generation Alpha are about approximately 10 years old, just to give you a sense. Okay. This figure might be a little hard to read, but what it summarizes is really the multitude of forms of communication that have been created and that are used currently in today's society. So we are so connected in so many ways that it is almost unavoidable. So adults and children nowadays can connect via music platforms, video, location tracking, school-based programs, blogs, forums, text messaging, video chat, social media, direct messaging. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And so how do we define social media specifically? Social networking sites are really considered to be kind of a subset of social media. So there's a few slightly different definitions out there, but social media is typically defined as a networked communication platform, and it involves user-generated profiles, some type of connection with other people, and some kind of interactive content. So that might be messages, that might be video, that might be photos. And some people can distinguish between like traditional communication media like email, text messaging, or Skype, and then social media being Facebook, for example. Even more specifically, there are different types of social media engagement. So in the literature, there are kind of passive users who usually access content just by scrolling, watching videos. They don't necessarily interact or like don't respond to like posts and make comments or even create their own content. But by contrast, active social media users post more content. They socialize with others via messaging and comments. And these differences are going to have some implications and the impact on functioning, which I will talk about in a little bit. We also know that with the evolution of social media, it has created almost another language when it comes to types of content and social dynamics and experiences that really take place online. So there's many, many, many more terms used by youth, but these are kind of common day-to-day terms that, you know, for some of the families that we work with, their parents may or may not be familiar with these terms. And so this is one area in which this can be helpful to encourage parents as they are trying to learn social media or really keep up with what their children are talking about and how they're engaging in social media, to really try to understand what these terms mean. So despite the prevalence of usage, there's actually not a lot of research that has focused on early childhood and the use of digital devices. And so most of the research has focused on adolescents and then a little bit on school-age children. But what we do know is that children starting at birth are being introduced to the world of technology. via their parents. And some statistics tell us that about 85% of families in the United States use video chat as a common method by which children connect with like distant relatives or maybe family members that are on a trip and just away for a short period of time. So we have all probably seen at least a few times a baby or maybe a toddler that is holding an iPhone or using some kind of device. And we know that there's some evidence that children under the age of 2 use a mobile device almost on a daily basis. So this figure might be a little blurry, but I hope that you can kind of get the idea that there have actually been several research programs that have examined the percentages of youth with access to or who have a smartphone. So we know that smartphones are the predominant method of social media use. However, we know that kids also use tablets and computers as well. So the numbers across studies and reports are pretty consistent. So as you might be able to see, the percentage of children ages 8 to 18 who own a smartphone has increased even from years 2015 to 2019. And there's even some other data that suggests 95% of adolescents ages 13, about 17, own or have access to a smartphone. And then 41%, just a little bit less than half of kids ages 8 to 12 in the United States have their own smartphone. So these are really high numbers. So we know that kids are really have increased access. That's really easy for them to kind of get involved in the digital world. Reports from 2019 found that children ages 8 to 12 spent an average of 4 hours and 4 minutes looking at a screen. With adolescents ages 13 to 18 spending an average of 7 hours and 22 minutes of screen time each day. And actually, more recent reports suggest that this number might even be higher for teens. So indicating that teens are actually spending upwards to 9 hours a day. So that is a lot of time. And we all know too well that the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of subsequent lockdowns really caused a surge in screen time for children. And so this was by means of virtual schooling or just increased time available to spend on digital devices. So these results are based on a nationally representative survey of more than 1,600 8 to 18-year-olds in the United States, and that looked at their relationship with the media. So among tweens, or kind of what we consider to be like 8 to 12, about half of all screen use was devoted to TV or videos, which I will say includes YouTube. So a lot of times YouTube is still considered to be in that category of social media due to kind of the interactive features of it. Among teens, 39% of screen use is devoted to watching TV or videos, again, including YouTube, with 16% using social media. So there really continues to be kind of a big difference between boys and girls in terms of what they enjoy regarding entertainment and social media platforms. So among teens, social media use is most common compared to other age groups, including girls enjoying social media a lot compared to about 1/3 of boys. And 70% of teen girls say that they use social media every day compared to about 56% of boys. So we're seeing definitely more use of social media among teens, which is why a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about today is focused on adolescent populations, but that's really the population that is using social media more so than other ages. So nearly all social networking sites only allow users age 13 and older. This age limit has been dictated by the US law through the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA is how it's referred to. And this act was first ordered to basically require sites to restrict the data that was collected for children that were ages 13 and younger. It also was put in place to make sure that parents were involved and really consenting to the information that children were either getting access to or disclosing on the internet. So there's some data that suggests that since the passage of this in 1998, it really has protected children's safety and privacy. But we know that kids are really tech savvy now. And even with some of the restrictions that social media platforms put in place, there are children that are younger than 13 who are still accessing social media platforms. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the dangers and risks related to that here in a little bit. In terms of specific platforms that children are using, 76% is for children ages 8 to 12 that use YouTube. YouTube is very, very popular, and I will say there's actually an alternative for kids. It's kids YouTube, but we know from the research that kids are actually not using kids YouTube as much. They're using the regular YouTube. So we also know 75% of teens have at least one active social media profile, and most often they have more than one. So Facebook is actually kind of decreasing in popularity among teens. It used to be the most popular social media platform, but YouTube, followed by Instagram, and then Snapchat, and now TikTok are really the most popular social media platforms that are used, especially among teens. And TikTok, as some of you may have heard, and some of you may have actually recently engaged in as well, including myself, is the fastest growing new app as of 2019. And some reports actually suggest that 18 million users are 14 years and younger. So TikTok has really made efforts. If they are seeing kids that are too young to be on that platform, they will try to take steps to either remove content or try to limit access. But we know that this is really, really hard to do. And kids that are younger than 13 are still accessing lots of different social media. I just found this statistic to be really interesting. Adolescents send and receive an average between 20 and 80 text messages per day. That seems like a lot. You know, I kind of reflected on my daily text messages, and I don't think that I send or receive that many in a day. But this is happening on a daily basis for teens. So really what the takeaway is here is that teens, including even younger children, are really using social media a lot. They are on their devices a lot. This is part of daily life. So with these dramatic changes in use of digital media, researchers and even just the lay public have really wanted to understand the nature and the direction of the association between online activities and psychological functioning and outcomes. So due to this kind of exponential increase in the adoption of social media tools, we have seen really a fundamental reshaping of the landscape regarding how teens in particular interact with each other online. So I'm not going to go into great detail about this model, but Jacqueline Nessie at Brown University and her colleagues have recently proposed this transformation framework. So essentially, they propose that there are 5 kind of key ways in which adolescent peer interactions have changed. So just kind of briefly, there is now potential for frequent, immediate social support, but also increased reassurance seeking and feedback seeking, and even co-rumination. We also see increased expectations to maintain relationships, accessibility, multitasking, like you are expected to multitask, and then heightened feedback seeking from peers. Nessie and her colleagues also propose that social support is more easily provided and received, but there also might be increased conflict and interpretation biases. So we know that depending on the ways in which teens are interacting on social media, we already know that in-person interactions can result in interpretation biases. We know that this is even heightened more so online. And then teens are able to stay connected to distant friends and family members. And now there's even ways to kind of publicly display top friends potentially, but also just the relationships that teens have in their life. Nessie and her colleagues also proposed kind of several features of social media platforms, including things like the permanency of content, the accessibility of information, the time lapse between interpersonal exchanges. So the time that we expect people to respond is much shorter than it used to be. And if we don't receive responses from people, then we start to kind of make up stories about that. That starts to affect our relationships. We also see a lot of like public social metrics, like, you know, likes and just digital attention. Like, how much are people paying attention to the things that I post, the photos, the videos, kind of what's on my profile, like what kind of attention am I getting for that? And so these features, as you can see kind of on these charts, really differ just depending on the type of social media platform that's used. There's also some growing evidence that digital stress is an important factor in understanding the relationship between digital media use and psychological outcomes. So digital stress has been defined as the stress that results from strong and almost permanent use of information, which is triggered by permanent access to an inconceivable amount and diversity of social content. So this term is really used to kind of describe the cognitive, the emotional, even the physiological arousal that accompanies like notifications that we receive, kind of regardless of the platform. And this is a subjective experience. So I know for myself, when I see that little notification on my phone, that causes a little bit of stress. I know that I have something to attend to. Someone is waiting on me, or there is something that I need to respond to or pay attention to. And sometimes there are several of those across apps or across kind of different ways of communicating. So kind of digital stress is sort of a new term that we are looking into nowadays. These are the components of digital stress. So they include kind of availability stress, how available are you digitally, approval anxiety, so like anxiety related to how other people are going to react to your content, your comment, you know, your digital footprint. There's fear of missing out. So we're able to see what other people are doing, who they're with, you know, and it creates this kind of experience and this stress related to, you know, missing out of those opportunities or wishing that you were doing the things that other people are doing. And then we also see kind of connection overload. And so this is really distress kind of resulting from like a subjective experience of sort of receiving an excessive amount of input. And so again, this includes like notifications and the amount of text messages that people are receiving. So one of the most frequently identified components of digital stress is availability stress. So this includes feelings of like guilt and anxiety related to the lack of responding or the degree of availability. And this really pushes teens in particular to be on their devices constantly because there is that pressure to be available. So kind of this idea that like my friends expect me to be constantly available is really a predictor of what we refer to as communication load. Like how much communication are you having to attend to? That second component of approval anxiety. is really that arousal of others' responses and reactions. And this really reflects the extent to which, digital profiles are maintained to reflect a really positive self-image and presentation. This is a really important construct to pay attention to, because we know that teens developmentally are seeking social validation, they're seeking approval from other people, and they're really engaging in a lot of social comparisons. So the ways in which we can present ourselves online can really influence that experience and that way that we're comparing ourselves to other people. And then fear of missing out. A lot of adolescents and even young adults really rely on digital media to learn about what other people are doing, what is going on in the world. And FOMO is kind of how it is referred to. So some of you may have heard that before. Your team's talking about FOMO. And some of the research has found that FOMO actually was related to kind of parent-reported symptoms of anxiety and depression in their teens. And that relationship between FOMO and depression and anxiety was really explained by this need to belong, or this need for popularity, which we know are really, really common developmentally expected sort of experiences in the teenage years. And then connection overload. What I'll say about this is, we can have one teen who has 156 notifications on their phone across platforms. And they might be not stressed by that. They might not perceive that as being kind of overloaded with alerts. And you can have another teen who has the same amount of notifications that is really stressed by that. And so really this is a subjective experience. And I will talk a little bit too throughout the rest of this presentation about how it's really important as mental health professionals that we are considering kind of individual characteristics of a child and of the family, because we know that we do that with other kind of phenomenon or other types of mental health conditions. We really have to think about things and conceptualize things, respective to the child and family that we're working with. So using social media really becomes a risk, more so than some adults think that it does. And so, this risk kind of falls into several categories. And some of the research recently has found that the number of social media accounts, the frequency in which teens are checking their accounts, is related to parent-reported symptoms of ADHD, depression, and anxiety. We also have seen stronger emotional connections with social media and increased anxiety, depression symptoms. So when teens are restricted in terms of accessing social media platforms or kind of engaging with their friends online, they get upset. And this is associated with poor sleep quality and increase in those kind of mental health symptoms. So we also know that there's can be some risky sexual behaviors. Just as one example, sexting. This is sending, receiving, or kind of forwarding sexually explicit messages or photographs or images kind of across a variety of devices. And there was actually a recent survey that found 20% of teens have sent or posted nude or semi-nude photos or videos of themselves. And this is obviously a really, really important thing to pay attention to, because some teens who have engaged in sexting actually have been threatened or charged with felony child pornography. And, so it's not just important for this teen's kind of life and reputation, but depending on the type of sexual behaviors that teens are engaging in, this can really become a big safety issue. Cyberbullying is another one. So this is really other people communicating or posting kind of false or embarrassing, like hostile information about somebody else. And it's the most common online risk actually for teens. And we know that cyberbullying has been related to depression, anxiety, severe isolation, and then in some really severe cases, suicide. Acceptance and contact with peers, we know, is an important element of adolescent life. So the intensity of kind of the online world can trigger depression, low self-esteem. And we know that in the research, there's actually some mixed findings in terms of the direction of the effect of social media use. For example, a lot of times we think that social media use kind of predicts depressive symptoms, but the research has also found the opposite, that pre-existing depressive symptoms actually predicts more social media use, which can then sort of just contribute to possibly a negative cycle. We also know that there are risks related to privacy. So, teens kind of sharing too much information, posting false information about themselves, what kind of information they are posting. And this is really kind of what we consider to be that digital footprint. What are the things that are publicly available online that people can use to either track you down and know where you are located, or really kind of use potentially against you, depending on the consumers of that information. So this is something that we really want to communicate to parents and then teens as well, that we need to be really thoughtful about the information that we're sharing online, because this can have implications and negative consequences, for future job applications and college. And so we have to be really, this has to be something that is communicated about frequently. We also know that social media use affects sleep. So kids are using their phones in their bedroom. They are up later because they are using a variety of platforms, possibly, whether they're interacting with others or not, they are still using digital devices. And with our older teens who are driving, there's also concerns related to, are they texting? Are they messaging? Are they creating content? Like, are they creating videos while they're driving? Sometimes we see this online, even as adults. So these are, again, things that we need to be really cognizant of, because we know that, especially in teens, their frontal lobe is developing. They do not have the executive functioning abilities to be able to kind of inhibit and control kind of that impulse to do certain things. And then a lot of social media sites display kind of advertisements through like banner ads that are really targeting people kind of based on their online behavior and their demographics. So we know that this can influence teens, and potentially kind of possibly, if they have the ability to purchase something, or they might end up giving information like credit card information or personal information that they shouldn't. And so we know that children are kind of becoming like literate in a way of some of these online things that as adults we are familiar with and that we come across and sometimes have trouble navigating. And then one of the things that we see is that teens are really accessing health information, which is good. However, we know that you can easily kind of come across inappropriate, but potentially inaccurate information, and in severe cases, really harmful information. Unfortunately, there are websites out there and organizations that encourage self-harm and suicide, and even like anti-LGBTQ organizations, and that can have significant impact on teens who are potentially privately accessing this information and not seeking social support for those things. So there's been some experimental studies about abstaining from social media, and it's really yielded mixed results. So some studies have found that abstaining from or limiting access to social media actually is associated with feelings of disconnection. But research has also found that it's been associated with increased life satisfaction and positive affect. So again, we really have to kind of determine like what is happening with our individual patients and families. And as I mentioned earlier, the type of social media engagement, whether you are more passive or whether you're more active, can also influence how you are impacted by the degree to which you're limited by social media use. So I talked a lot about the risks associated with social media use. We know that there's actually a lot of benefits. So babies today are really kind of immersed in the digital world, as I mentioned earlier, and they're actually forming relationships online. So, you know, they are interacting with their grandparents potentially, or they're able to still see their parent if they are, you know, on a trip for a short period of time. And we also know that there's actually some benefit to some developmental processes, like helping kids develop this idea of joint attention, language development, and really other kind of social and emotional skills. Social media sites also allow for easy social connection and access to social support. So kids are able to make new friends, they can exchange ideas, they can participate in some kind of community organizations and charity. We know that depending on the ways in which children are engaging in social media use, this can also really kind of increase their creative expression and contribute to their development of their identity. That this has a positive impact in that regard. And we know that preteens and teens also use social media, and schools are using certain types of platforms to help kids connect and sort of collaborate on school projects. And so we see kind of increased and enhanced learning opportunities. And we see that this actually results in kind of reinforcing skills related to reading and writing and creativity. And then, as I mentioned, adolescents in particular are finding more and more health information, which actually can be really helpful. So they are able to kind of read about different diseases, different conditions, and this has actually been shown to help with medication adherence and really normalizing some of the symptoms that they might be experiencing, because not all of these teens are engaged in or participate in mental health services. And then, of course, there is just endless entertainment. And I'll talk about some of the ways in which we need to kind of think about the degree to which we're spending time. But we know that there are lots of benefits, and that we cannot just jump to the conclusion that social media is bad or that it has just negative outcomes. So really kind of the takeaways here is that the research is really mixed. There's lots of positive outcomes, there's lots of negative outcomes. Some research studies will find one thing, and then another research study will find the very opposite. We do know that peer experiences online often mirror offline experiences. And so the types of interactions that we typically see and that we've seen in the past and that we know about are also happening online as well. But we really need a lot more research, and we need a lot more research that is dedicated to looking at some of these dynamics and outcomes kind of longitudinally. So parenting in the digital age. This has really introduced a lot of challenges to parenthood. So a lot of parents today use technology well, and they feel comfortable and capable with different programs, but there are a lot of parents still that lack kind of basic understanding of like these new forms of socializing, and they just have a hard time keeping up with the landscape. So We know that parents are really stressed. They worry about their kids spending time in front of screens. But we also know that similar to other safety issues, we know that parental control and monitoring is really important. So just some data here, kind of showing that parents need support. Parents are concerned about the ways in which and the degree to which their children are engaging online, and they're actually getting parenting advice or information mostly from doctors and other mental health professionals. And so we are in a unique position to, one, really be versed in this issue, and also make sure that we are aware and that we're prepared to talk about this topic with families. So I found these statistics interesting. So there was a nationally representative survey that was conducted in 2019, and you can see that compared to children, parents are kind of monitoring what a child does more so. That's not surprising. But I was actually surprised to see that half of parents were monitoring their kind of pre-adolescent child's activity. And then 26% of parents who have teens are monitoring their activity. So, this is something that kind of indicates like we need to maybe spend more time talking to parents about the importance of monitoring. So what can you do as a mental health professional? Really, we want to reinforce the use of parental monitoring apps and software. There are many out there. The ones that I have listed, I did quite a bit of research on these. These are probably the most commonly used and advertised. They have pros and cons, and really the ways that parents can choose which software or app that they that best fits their needs is really dependent on the age of their child, what kind of devices that their children have access to, what types. We know that actually Android devices have a little bit more safety features than iPhones. And then cost is really a big factor as well. Kaspersky Kids and Kids Locks are probably the two most affordable for families who might not have the financial resources to purchase some of these other monitoring softwares. Suggest kind of social media alternatives for young children. There's a lot that are available, but really parents need to do some research on the different apps in app stores, because some apps will actually advertise that they have safety features in place, but there's lots of flaws. And so these are just some examples of ones that I found in my research that might be really good alternatives and kind of help children and their parents kind of practice online behavior and practice interacting with other people in a safe way. So there's a lot of child-friendly features like games and contests and different ways that kids can create content and share that and kind of do that in a really safe and controlled way. We also want parents to stay in communication with their children and stay connected. So we need to encourage parents to talk about kind of physical and emotional safety issues related to social media use. So for example, turning off that location-enabled service and explaining to kids why that's important to do. Some parents are also on social media, and so, depending on the age of their child, they want to maybe discuss like if and how they're going to interact with their children on social media. Are they going to be friends? Are they going to message each other? Are they going to be okay with commenting on, each other's posts and pictures? Parents really need to review privacy settings and review kind of the information that children should not be reporting or listing online. right? So addresses, telephone numbers, especially social security numbers, passwords, credit card information. So teens really need to be aware of the negative consequences potentially of doing that. And then really continue to encourage like digital free time. So there's no evidence to suggest that, you know, parents and children should not be spending time, you know, on digital devices together. But there are some recommendations out there just related to having some no screen times. And so parents are really encouraged to kind of think about how this might look for their family, what makes sense, and kind of what they're comfortable with. We want to encourage parents to report and document cyberbullying. So, you know, thankfully, social media sites have kind of terms, and cyberbullying often violates those terms. And so it's really important for parents to kind of review what those terms are with different social media platforms, make sure that they understand how can we block people, how do we change privacy settings, and then what are the things that we can do to take action if cyberbullying does happen. So a lot of sites will actually respond and take care of issues related to cyberbullying. And so kind of limiting access to people who are engaging in cyberbullying. And it's important that while children are in school, that cyberbullying is reported to the school as well, because oftentimes if a child is experiencing cyberbullying, that they are also experiencing in-person bullying as well. And so it's important for schools to be aware so that they can use that information and, you know, really help children at school and really respond to potentially bullying that's happening in that environment. And then, of course, contacting law enforcement, you know, especially as it relates to kind of threats of violence. The unfamiliarity that some parents have has really kind of steered certain caregivers to like negatively react to their child's use of technology. So it's really important for parents to really strive for balance and not be too overly rigid or too overly permissive and loose. So as mental health professionals, we can rely on the evidence-based strategies that we already use with families and just apply that to digital time and social media use. It's also important to try and set boundaries within your own clinical setting. And so this might be in-person visits as well as virtual visits. So we might need to set some rules with children about phone use and multitasking on devices. And this also might be relevant with parents, kind of depending on the nature and the circumstances. I know I've worked with some parents that tend to be on their phone while we're kind of discussing things, or they're not really engaged because they are doing other things on their phone. And, you know, we know that parents are really busy and they might need to attend to certain things kind of going on. And that can become a barrier to engagement and, you know, their effectiveness in helping support their child in therapy. And then what we learned from the research is that, you know, social media is really dependent upon a child and family's circumstances and their psychological functioning. So with other things that we respond to and manage in clinical settings, we have to still remember to keep individual characteristics and culture and values and different life circumstances in mind. There is the family media plan. And this is something that can help families kind of create rules and boundaries with time on digital devices. So if you just kind of Google family media plan, it should pop up. And then connect parents to resources. These resources are listed in the documents that Chad has uploaded to the webinar, so you should have access to those. And these are also resources to really read up on as mental health professionals. Childhood 2.0, I will say, is a documentary that came out in 2020. And it features children and their parents and provides insight into kind of the digital age and talks a lot about some of the issues and things that come up. So it is available on YouTube. And then parents need to model appropriate behavior. So, just like we would encourage parents to be mindful of like yelling, for example, if we are trying to help kids learn how to use inside voices. We want to encourage parents that if they are using devices, are they sort of violating their own rules that they're putting in place for their children? Are they communicating about their use to their children, really staying connected again? And then really being mindful of the content that they share and their availability based on how much they're on their devices. And that kind of gets into parents' use of social media, which I'm going to kind of go through quickly here. Essentially, we know that over the years, there's been an increase in the amount of social media use among adults. There is this concept of sharenting or oversharenting. And this is referred to as this practice of parents who are like publicly sharing content about their children on social media. And so this is a little bit different than, parents kind of seeking information through maybe online forums or, maybe anonymously trying to get information to kind of help their children in a variety of ways. So, children have an interest in privacy, and, they are sort of at the mercy of what their parents choose to do and what their parents choose to share about them online. So they're really the gatekeepers of their children's personal information. And they now are creating a narrative for their child digitally. So children, by the time they even are able to access social media, they already potentially have a long history of digital footprint. And so this is really something important to talk about in clinical settings, because this is another kind of social dynamic that can really take place between parents and children and maybe cause some problems. If you guys haven't heard, I came across this case. I didn't hear about it, but it was the formerly Daddy 05 case. They're called Family 05 now. Unfortunately, this was a popular but controversial YouTube channel where parents were pulling pranks on their children, and there was actually some signs of physical and emotional harm. And so this dad lost custody of 2 of his children who now live with their mom. And so, this is an extreme example, but it's something that parents really need to be aware of about what they are posting about their kids. So there's some recommendations within the Children's Privacy in the Age of Social Media resource, and parents really should kind of familiarize themselves with privacy policies, potentially set up notifications to alert them if their child's name appears in a search result. Again, kind of consider sharing information anonymously, and then depending on the child's age, maybe give them sort of some say over what parents are disclosing online about them. And being very careful about, the state of undress. There's lots of families now who are posting, pictures of their baby and, young children, just kind of in all different sorts of states. And so we just need to be mindful of kind of the long-term implications of that. And how children later on are going to kind of look back on the information that's out there about them. Okay. We have a couple minutes for questions. I am available to kind of stick on for a few minutes over the hour here if people have questions.
All right. Thank you. So I put the code up here for folks. If you'd like to earn a CEU, Today's code is 1006, and I will send an email after we're done here today, and you'll need to enter that code into the survey to get your CEU. So we did have a couple of questions come in, but feel free to type those in. Dr. Daugherty, do you have any sort of recommendations on how to approach, tension between preteens' desire for increased privacy with the need for the parents to monitor, their device usage? Basically, how can we get preteens on board rather than it feeling like a violation? I know you kind of brought that up earlier, but any kind of tips or tricks that you have?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and a really common issue that comes up. We sort of talk about just this idea of like moderation and balance a lot in therapy. So, one of the things that we want to strive for is helping parents to kind of avoid those extremes. And so really kind of being open with their children about what are the reasons why they might be monitoring, their chat or their activity, and really being open with kids about, what parents are actually doing, like what is the frequency in which they are checking, and really how does their child feel about that. I think kind of opening that line of communication can actually sort of relieve some of those defenses that come up with kids. So really having open communication and a rationale for why parents are wanting to monitor and be involved in their child's life, digitally, and really emphasizing that safety is number one. And so kind of helping parents to determine like what would be a safety behavior versus maybe some other things that maybe they just don't understand, that can help prevent parents from maybe overreacting to certain things that they see, and really having a curious stance. This actually came up this week for me, where one of the teens I'm working with, she had a name on her social media profile that just was inappropriate, and the caregiver I worked with approached her about it in a really benevolent way, and it became clear that this teen didn't actually know the term that she used for her name, that it was kind of sexual in nature. And so they were able to work that out and get that changed, and I think that was a really effective way that parents were kind of engaging with their teen, and that relationship wasn't really damaged because of that. I hope that information helps with that question.
Thanks. Well, I think it does. I'm seeing lots of thank you comments. And so I know folks might have to leave here, but the CEU code is up there, and I'll send an email out shortly. One more maybe question is about some of the resources, like monitoring resources out there. Are there programs that monitor content of photos or videos? I think maybe in the I wasn't sure, maybe in the handouts there, Dr. Daugherty, if there was one specifically that kind of monitored photos or videos at all, or?
Yeah, as you were asking that question, I was trying to think back. I think that is one of the limitations of several of the software options that are available, unfortunately.